Hello, welcome to my channel. I'm John Peters. As a therapist who has been using mindfulness and meditation in my practice quite a bit for the last 25 years, I decided that I'm going to share some videos on this channel that talk about how to use mindfulness to lower anxiety, cope with stress, and improve mood and general well being. And I wanted to share the basis for my history of working with and learning about practicing and sharing mindfulness and meditation. But it's kind of a long story. So, in the videos where I talk about how to practice, how to apply it, different thoughts about why it works, and some of the research about the benefits of mindfulness, I didn't really want to include this chunk in those videos because it will take up a little bit of time. So if you're watching this video, it means that I came up with a way to tell this story and decided that it was coherent enough to actually post it. So I'm going to share my history with learning about practicing and then sharing mindfulness and meditation so that my other videos might make a little more sense. Okay, so chapter 1. This begins before I was born in two ways. One is that I was born with a family history of anxiety and depression. My mother had generalized anxiety and chronic dysthymia, which is mild depression. My father had generalized anxiety and social anxiety and chronic mild depression. My maternal grandfather had generalized anxiety, and I believe my maternal grandmother had some form of anxiety as well. I have other close family members that have noticeable clinically significant anxiety. So, you can go Google anxiety and hereditary factors, but there is something to the biological basis of having family history with lots of anxiety. So, in one way, I was set up to be born as someone who more likely than not was going to deal with some personal anxiety. Okay. Now, factor two with my family history was that at the time I was born, my family had been involved for two generations at that point in a religious cult. And so, long story short, I grew up with an arguably clinically wacky and dysfunctional and abusive childhood. Um, my parents and grandparents were involved in this religious cult that was not the People's Temple. You remember the People's Temple back with the Kool-Aid? But I will tell you that Jim Jones himself did show up in my family's personal home Super 8 movies at one point. So, you know, similarly dysfunctional if you know about all the news stories of the People's Temple, but the cult that my family was in, they never ended up drinking all the Kool-Aid. But it was pretty dysfunctional, and as a result, I grew up in a situation of pretty extreme emotional, psychological, and physical abuse myself. So, family history of anxiety and abusive childhood situation, all of that added up to me getting somewhat dysfunctional by my teen years, meaning that I was struggling to figure out how to cope with myself and my life in lots of ways. And I was doing some pretty decidedly dysfunctional things like drug use, drinking, reckless behavior, kind of the normal teen stuff, but turned up to 11. So in my later teens, I was, and by the way, I eventually escaped. And the short version of that story is I got my driver's license and drove away, basically. But in my teen years, I was struggling with, my own history of abuse and mood issues and my own anxiety, and also not fully satisfied with how I was coping with all of that. And so I was looking around for more functional ways to try to deal with my issues, myself, my life, my stress. And I started experimenting with a variety of wellness techniques like yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, different forms of meditation, and getting more into better self care, taking care of my diet, getting good exercise. And so quitting drinking was a good one. But what I started finding, not surprisingly, was that a lot of these types of wellness techniques were actually very effective in many ways for me to cope with my moment to moment stress and anxiety and to rework how I was relating to being triggered and getting anxious and improving my overall well being. And so the point of this first part of the story is that I got pretty enthusiastic about a broad and wide range of experimentation with personal wellness techniques. And in that early phase, in my late teens into my through my 20s, part of what that meant for me was that for a long time I was doing pretty regular yoga, multiple times a week for a few years. And I also was practicing different forms of meditation, um, and mostly Zen meditation, but similar to mindfulness, and we could talk about that in another video maybe. But I was practicing meditation daily, anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour for several years. And through that experimentation, I learned a lot about not only how meditation can be used as a component of wellness for me and potentially others, but also how it not only affects like my direct state, like if I'm upset and I meditate, what happens then? Can I calm down? But I also was learning a lot about how it changes your actual system. So the prolonged practice, and part of how I learned this was with the waxing and waning of my commitment to different forms of practice. You know, you do something and you get a change. You don't necessarily know that that something is producing that change until you take that something back away or you change how you're doing it. And so because I got into these practices and did them consistently for years, part of what that meant for me was that I learned when I either took time off from it or changed how I was doing it, I could notice how it was changing me and changing how I reacted to things. And so the first several years of my own path, this was before I was a therapist, because I was an undergrad and I took a scenic route through my undergrad. It took me 10 years to finish my bachelor's degree. Um, so, so it was a long period of experimentation, but I learned a lot about what I needed to know for myself, but what later would end up potentially being helpful as I then shared this type of practice in the context of being a therapist. So that's chapter one. Okay, chapter two. All right. So this begins actually during chapter one. I'm an undergrad. At some point, I realized that I wanted to finish my undergrad degree and not stay in school forever, and get a master's degree so that I could get credentialed and become a psychotherapist. Right. So I continued studying meditation myself in terms of my personal practice. And by the way, my undergrad degree was in religious studies, which meant I could study East Asian religions and read tons and tons of old religious texts about meditation and get credits for it, right? So that's what I did with my undergrad degree. And then I went to grad school to get a master's in social work so I could get my credential to be a therapist. And I continued to study, but at that point, I was starting to look a lot more deeply at the research literature about meditation and mindfulness for general well being, but also especially psychological issues like mood issues and anxiety. And so, to give a little more context for what was going on at the time I was looking at it, I finished my degree and became a therapist in 1998. But um, the interest in meditation and in Western psychology started back in the late 60s and early 70s, right? So people like me who were in psychology in the West, people started going over to East Asia, India and Japan and China and Southeast Asia, like Thailand, Burma, Laos, and places like that, and trying to figure out what can we learn about contemplative practices as it applies to what we have as reasonable areas of focus and goals in Western psychology, and how can we bring that back and translate that into something that's potentially an adjunct and a helpful component of Western psychological evaluation and treatment, right? So you might have heard of what is still popular, which is called mindfulness-based stress reduction. So part of what got worked out, and this is mostly developed and promoted by John Kabat-Zinn, who still teaches today. But what they worked out was, although when they went to Asia and they were looking at these Buddhist monks and Indian monks who had been practicing thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of meditation and seemed to have these benefits that were very desirable for us in the West, they knew that when they came back, they couldn't tell people, like, the answer to your life problems is to go become a monk and live in a temple so you can do thousands of hours of meditation. It's not practical, right? And so I think a lot of why the mindfulness-based stress reduction protocol got developed. This is my take on it. You can go read Kabat-Zinn and others in terms of talking about the justification for the protocol. But what they decided was 40 minutes of yoga and meditation a day for 6 weeks, and then a half-day retreat at the end to kind of solidify the overall practice. Um, and that became the standard protocol, both in terms of what therapists often would recommend people to do and what, like, wellness programs through HR programs at work would teach employees and companies that adopted this type of stuff. And also, it ended up being the protocol for the research. So if you go look at a lot of the early research in the 80s and 90s, a very large percentage of it that's studying mindfulness and meditation and things like anxiety and mood and things that are of concern to Western psychology, what you find is, that's the protocol being used, and that's why the basis exists empirically for the recommendation for people like me to say, oh, you want to have less anxiety? There's this research that says that it works for that. And if you want to do what the research looked at, then you want to do the mindfulness-based stress reduction protocol, which is 40 minutes of yoga and mindfulness practice a day for 6 weeks, right? And so that's interesting, but what you obviously run into, and what I ran into, was the barrier to actually recommending to that a lot of folks, because the protocol is provided with a lot of direct guidance. And as an outpatient psychotherapist who has someone who comes to see me once a week, and we talk about a variety of their life issues and their goals, and where I want to incorporate mindfulness as a component of that, I don't really have the engagement with most clients to be able to guide them through learning and then following through with that fairly heavy commitment of that type of practice, right? And if I describe it well so they understand it, just the feasibility aspect alone is going to mean that a lot of people aren't going to initiate and certainly follow through with that type of practice. Now, I'm not poo-pooing that. I actually think that's a decent protocol to follow. I may talk about more about that in another video, but really what I learned when I started practicing and started trying to figure out how can I teach patients something that's relevant about mindfulness and meditation practice, that's consistent with the goals of what they want to pursue with me as their therapist, but that is also very feasible and that's going to work in terms of them actually doing it, and also that is going to be reliable so that they get the results that they want. Like, why am I sharing it if it's not supportive of their goals, right? Um, so this is chapter 2 is me then being a therapist who's experimenting with what can I share with people so that they actually are going to be able to do it, and they're actually going to do it, and they can actually get some results that are meaningful. Chapter 3. Okay. So I'm a therapist. I'm incorporating mindfulness meditation in some ways to try to see if I can share it with people consistent with their goals of, like lowering their anxiety, improving their mood, and things like that. I'm continuing to look at the research. So over the years, I've read hundreds of studies about meditation that's looked at it in lots of different ways. And over the first many years of my practice, I started gaining experience of sharing different ways that people could try to do a little bit of practice and potentially actually do it and then actually get some benefit out of it, right? So I also decided at one point to go back and get a doctorate degree, which, by the way, I didn't finish. I did all of my coursework. I ended up deciding not to finish the doctorate and didn't turn in my dissertation, so I'm not Dr. Peters. But um, when I went back to get my doctorate, I decided to also continue to look at the research in mindfulness meditation because I was going to incorporate it into my thesis potentially when I wrote my dissertation. So I continued to look at a lot of the research. And I also, when I went back to get my doctorate, I started teaching at Indiana University in the School of Social Work, mostly in the grad program, but also I was teaching in the School of Public Health in their undergrad program. And I had the opportunity to start teaching a full semester course on stress management, which I will tell you was wildly rewarding. I loved every minute of it. Over 15 years, I taught, I think, 40 full semester courses to probably around 4,000 students. And in that course, we covered a wide range of stress management techniques, but I did use mindfulness practice as a central practice in the course, right? So over many years of the early part of my career, I had all these different patients that I worked with in different ways, which allowed me to learn how to incorporate feasible types of recommendations to patients. And then also with these thousands of students, I was getting feedback from them about the practices that I was teaching them and how they were working for them, right? So part of what I thought about was that even though I have done quite a lot of intensive practice, so by my mid-career, I had logged thousands of hours personally of meditation, but that was not what I was wanting to recommend. I'm not saying do what I did and then you'll get this kind of result. What I wanted to know is what can I share that's feasible that people will actually do and that actually will give them the result. And what I had learned was that while it is kind of dose dependent, when you do more, you get a little bit more. But, the question about, like, well, can we dial it down? What's the lower amount that would still give the benefits, but wouldn't necessarily require such a heavy commitment, right? Like, meaning on the practical level, what's something less than that mindfulness based stress reduction protocol, which I personally don't think is feasible for most people. I'll be honest with you. In 25 years of practice, I've probably had about 5 total people in my patient population say that they initiated and followed through and completed the mindfulness based stress reduction protocol, right? Now, do I think it's a good amount of practice if you can do it and follow through? Sure. But 5 patients out of several thousand in the last 25 years, to me, is not a great hit rate on completion, right? That's why I'm pretty motivated to think, okay, what's something less than that? If we dial that down into the feasible range, what's actually going to work, So, and also with my students, right? I don't know if you've ever worked with teenagers and people in their early 20s, right, who are students, but they've got so many things competing with their attention and their time and focus that, if I say to them, we're going to do something 40 minutes a day for 6 weeks, I'll get a 0% follow through. I guarantee it, right? So with my students, I was thinking, what can I teach them that they'll actually do and they'll actually complete in a way that they can let me know how it worked, and also they potentially could enjoy some benefits, right? So here's the end of that story in terms of what I decided that I learned about what you needed to do and what would be feasible for me to recommend to people so that there was a much higher likelihood that people would actually follow through in order to actually get the results. And what I settled on and what I teach today is to begin a practice by doing very short sessions, so literally like a minute at a time, and within the first week, working up to doing about 5 of those per day. So optimally, someone is doing a total of about 5 minutes of practice per day of mindfulness, which for a lot of people is feasible, right? And what I found was that when I was recommending that, I was getting a much, much higher percentage of people who were coming back and saying, actually, I did that, right? And it also means that if people want to practice within a session, so I'm doing 45-minute sessions conventionally with patients. That's what the industry does in terms of outpatient psychotherapy. Within a 45-minute session, we could do 2 or 3 easy little 1-minute practices so that I am able to give them that hands-on guidance of the actual practice that they're then going to translate into their out of session practice in between sessions, right? So it's way more practical, way more feasible, much, much higher rate of follow through in terms of sharing it, having people do it, and then see if they can get the results. And the good news is that having now been able to share this with thousands of students and thousands of patients, what I now know through all of the thousands of data points of feedback I've gotten from those people is that about 95% of people who do 4 to 5 minutes per day will start to unambiguously notice the benefits of mindfulness practice within about a week to 10 days. To me, that's good news. That means we don't have to wait 6 weeks to get the results. It also means that 45 minutes actually does produce the results. And by the results, I'll talk about this in a later video, but what I'm mostly talking about is people subjectively notice that their general stress level is lower, meaning their general anxiety level is lower. And people notice that when they get triggered, they don't flip out quite as strongly. When they get triggered, they come back to baseline after spiking up when they do spike up with a stress trigger. And some other related results, including that mood tends to be more positive, and people also pretty frequently report that their sleep quality gets better, right? And there are other results, and again, I'm going to come back around this and talk about this type of specific results that people can reasonably expect from this type of practice in a different video, but this one's mainly focused on just how I came to think about what I think about the practice of mindfulness in the context of wellness and including psychotherapy, right? So my attitude about what the best thing to share, and of course, I'm not the final expert on all this, and people have different opinions about this, but just for me, wanting to share this with my patients, over the years, sharing it with my students, and now starting this channel, and what I intend to promote here and what I recommend to you to experiment with to see if it works for you. This is all the basis of kind of how I came to think what I think about the practice. What do I do today, in terms of myself? For me, too, I have found that I don't need to be doing an hour a day to get the types of results that I want for myself. I probably am averaging a few minutes a day and have been for the last few years, right? Um, have I done some more intensive periods of more practice? Yes. And also, have I done um, times where I did some retreats, which I'll talk about in another video too, where you take a day, a weekend, a week, and do some extra practice. Yeah, and I think that's beneficial. But I will tell you that at the end of the day, my attitude is that you really only need to be doing about 45 minutes a day. And you can do an easy practice, which I'm going to describe in an upcoming video in terms of like how to do it. Um, but I wanted to make this video just to say this is the basis of how I came to know what I think I know about meditation and mindfulness practice and how it has benefited my patients and why I share it the way I do with my patients and why I did with the students I taught over the years, and why I make the particular recommendations in my videos here on this channel to you. So thanks for watching. If you like this kind of content, hit the like button. If you like my channel, feel free to subscribe. And in the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the logic of how we think meditation actually works to give those results that I mentioned a minute ago, right? So I'm going to give you the explanation of if you practice, why the type of practice I recommend is the type I recommend because it's the type that's most likely going to give you those particular results.